In this session, we're going to look at the relationship between mountains and war. As we're looking at mountains, and to make things more interesting than my back garden, I'll present all of Hokusai's 36 views of Mount Fuji. It's important to look at mountains, or rugged terrain, when looking at war. However, as with all of the things we've looked at so far, there's always the danger of determinism. We shouldn't assume that the presence of mountains will invariably have a certain effect. We'll look at mountains and war on a more quantitative level later in the course. For now, we'll look at some of the theories that have been explored to relate mountains to war over the past 2,000 years. One of the frameworks we have for understanding war and conflict comes from Harvey Starr, who gives us the opportunity and willingness framework. You have a greater chance of war or conflict if the actors involved have both the opportunity and willingness to engage in it. Curiously, mountains can fit into both of those frameworks. Mountains can affect the opportunity of actors to engage in conflict. Rugged or mountainous terrain has physical factors which may make conflict more or less likely. On the willingness, there is a belief among some that mountains change human behaviour. As we'll see, this one is a bit more tricky to deal with. We'll see this idea throughout the history of geography. If we go back to Strabo, we find his view that something inherent in the nature of mountains affects the human condition, and that this changed lot leads to war. We can see this idea right through the history of geography to the present day. It's there in the creation of political geography, in the changes in the politics of geography, in positivism, in Ratzel's anthropogeography, and in Darwinism. An idea that emerges in some literature is that there is a distinct mountain people. In the English literature, these are referred to as mountaineers, which is a bit confusing, as that's also the word we use for people who climb mountains. A little more easy to understand is the German literature, which distinguishes between Bergsteigers, those who climb mountains, and Gebirgsvölker, those who live in them. Often they live in Gebirgsstaaten, mountain states like Switzerland. When we scour through 2,000 years of writing on mountain people, we find some contradictory descriptions of mountain people, many of which have hints of scientific racism. Mountain people have been described as savage, yet of rigid morality, revolutionary, yet conservative, covetous, yet provident, democratic, yet opposed to civilization, passionately independent, yet of arrested political development, honest yet piratical, lawless yet united, healthy yet intermarried. Mountain people have also been described as warlike, courageous, wretched, brigands, brave, lovers of liberty, half-barbarian, isolated, poverty-stricken, reactionary, retarded, rude and simple, proud, vigorous, rustic, honourable, industrious, frugal, and indeed short. If you really fancy looking up all of those descriptions, then the citations are here. Now, clearly, some of those descriptions are just nonsense. But can we ignore them? Some of them, yes. But many of them remain central to modern discourse on conflict in mountains. Okay, back to where we started. There are two main reasons why mountains may be related to war and conflict. First, mountains form physical obstacles. Second, mountains affect human behaviour and nature. While there is considerable overlap between those two categories, it's useful to at least start with this distinction. The first category is the more straightforward to deal with. When George Mallory was asked by a journalist why he wanted to climb Mount Everest, he's famously supposed to have said, "Because it's there." To modify Mallory's response, why is a mountain relevant to war? Because it's there. Much of the work in this category is military in nature. A military space is not as flat and empty as O'Loughlin's billiard table. It's full of topographical discontinuities, such as mountains, deserts and forests. Merritt's conception of the different types of topography can be taken back as far as Sun Tzu, for whom there were 9 varieties of ground of relevance to war. Of those, mountainous terrain fell into 2 categories: difficult ground and death ground. The type of mountainous terrain in which your army found itself should determine what it would do. In difficult ground, press on. In death ground, fight. Mountains, therefore, modify the possibilities. Well, where you get Sun Tzu, you always get Clausewitz. Clausewitz said that the influence of mountains on the conduct of war is very great. The subject, therefore, is very important for theory. Clausewitz devoted 4 books on war to the subject of mountains, mostly writing about how to defend them. He tends to concur with Sun Tzu. Mountains, as terrain, are either difficult or deadly. Difficult in that marching up them is a slow process. Deadly in that comparatively small numbers of troops can launch successful counterattacks. He says, when a column, winding like a serpent, toils its way through narrow ravines up to the top of a mountain and passes over it at a snail's pace, flogging the overdriven cattle through the narrow rugged roads, each broken wagon has to be got out of the way with indescribable trouble, while all behind are detained, cursing and blaspheming. Every one of them thinks to himself, now, if the enemy should appear with only a few hundred men, he might disperse the whole. There are, of course, different types of mountain, and this is something that we'll come back to when we look at how to measure terrain. Clausewitz addresses this in his summary of the instruction given by the author to His Royal Highness the Crown Prince in the years 1810, 1811 and 1812. Mountain ranges with plateau or plains in the centre can be defended, while those which are more rugged are harder to defend. Hummer de Hell makes a similar point here. It's difficult for an army to traverse valleys leading to plains. Once they've reached them, they would be forced to occupy them, with the mountaineers waiting below. Alright, where are we so far? Mountains are relevant to war because they modify the military possibilities, they are difficult to traverse, they can be defended by smaller forces than those attacking. Once won, mountains are difficult to hold. Some types of mountains are easier to defend than others, and mountains have a capacity for border disputes. These may all be factors in the calculations of a rebel group. They may provide a rebel group with a greater degree of confidence in the success of their movement. Fear and Enlightenment put this plainly. Guerrillas need mountains, jungles, or in a few cases, deserts for bases of operations. The corollary to this argument is that governments may not want territory of rough terrain. Fear and Enlightenment make the case that land may be of value to both government and rebel groups if it contains easily appropriable wealth. Indeed, Toft argues that mountains can be of value. She defines a resource-rich variable, which includes factors such as minerals, dams, rivers, pasture and farmland, industry, and strategically important locales such as mountain passes or heights.